Don Tamaki interview, take one, marker.
I'm Don Tamaki. I was one of the members of the legal team that reopened Fred Korematsu's case in the 1980s. December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. Within a day or two, the Secret Service, the FBI, sweeps into cities and urban areas from Seattle to Arizona, arresting community leaders, martial arts instructors, Japanese school language teachers, Buddhist priests, anyone who held a leadership position were literally the next day taken away, separated from their families, and their families not knowing whether they would ever see them again or when they would return. It was the 9/11 of its day, and by February 19th, 1942, President Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066, and this empowered the military to take control of the 8 most western states. So on March 2nd, 1942, General DeWitt is placed in command of that whole western region. And within a few days, he declares the states of Washington, Oregon, California, and the southern half of Arizona to be military zones. And that was followed very swiftly within 2 weeks by Congress passing Public Law 503. And Public Law 503 said, whoever shall enter, remain in, leave, or commit any act in any military zone, and bear in mind now this is Washington, Oregon, California, Arizona, where almost 120,000 Japanese Americans had always lived, would be guilty of a crime and could be imprisoned. Within literally a few weeks after that, by the middle of March, General DeWitt issues an order saying that Japanese Americans could not leave Military Area 1. And then a month later, he issued another order, which said that Japanese Americans could not remain. So this was a predicament facing Japanese Americans. They were subject to these contradictory military orders, which simultaneously made them criminals if they left their home or if they didn't leave. Obedience to one portion of Public Law 503 would necessarily violate the other. So the only way they could avoid criminal prosecution was to report to these temporary prison camps in the San Francisco Bay Area where Fred Korematsu was put. This is a Tanforan racetrack. It's a horse racing track surrounded by barbed wire and machine gun towers. My family was also incarcerated there. And about 8,000 people were put into horse stalls, while 10 more permanent American-style concentration camps were being built from California to Arkansas. So by the end of 1942, you had almost 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry, 2,000 American citizens who had lost their property, they had lost their freedom, some had even lost their lives, all without trial and without any jury, without any trial, without any charges, and for no offense. After Executive Order 9066 was issued by the President, authorizing General John L. DeWitt to issue orders governing a civilian population, he began issuing public proclamations singling out Japanese Americans for first curfew, and then within literally weeks, a few days in some cases, orders to report to these temporary prison camps under the auspices of Public Law 503, which said that whoever shall enter, remain in, leave, or commit any act in a military zone could be imprisoned and taken away by the military. So as a consequence of that, Japanese Americans, including Fred Korematsu, were subjected to Public Law 503. And that rounded up almost 120,000 Americans, and of those, 2,000 were born in this country, never been to Japan. The other one-third were Japanese immigrants who, by law, were forbidden to naturalize. They were ineligible to be citizens by statute. So even if they wanted to naturalize and become citizens, they could not be. But because of the constitutional concept of birthright citizenship, people like my mother and my father who were born in California were citizens by birth. And 2/3 of those, of the 120,000, were American citizens like my parents. And they were mainly along the west coast. And they were then put into these camps. After the first 1 year or 2 years, some were allowed out if they could demonstrate that they were employed and if they signed loyalty oaths and the like. These tended to be young people who, in the second generation. But the older folks, that first generation, that 1/3, most of them remained in those camps until they closed. And for some, it was months after the war ended. And then they were left to go back to their own communities from whence they were exiled. And many were homeless. They were living, on the streets or living in churches. So that was their predicament. They had to literally start all over. Early on, right after Pearl Harbor, General DeWitt said that Japanese Americans are an enemy race. And even though there are second generation born on American soil, the racial lines are undiluted. Therefore, along the Pacific coast are almost 112,000 enemies of America at large today. And one of the most astounding statements he made is he said, the very fact that there is no evidence of espionage or sabotage occurring is confirming and disturbing evidence that it will occur. In other words, the fact that you've never committed a crime is proof positive that you will commit a crime. So that, again, this is the absurdity, the impossible situation that Japanese Americans found themselves in. They are criminals simply because they have not committed crimes. They are forced to comply with impossible military orders, where compliance with one portion of the order would necessarily violate the other. And all the forces of government and the public were bearing down on Japanese Americans at that time. There was about a 40-year run-up to Pearl Harbor where Japanese Americans and Asian Americans on the West Coast were the targets of being vilified and demonized. And so all along the Western coast, there were laws preventing Japanese Americans from owning property, from intermarrying, housing discrimination was the law of the day. Job discrimination laws did not exist. And so Japanese Americans were already a targeted community. So by the time December 7th, 1941 happened, the soil was tilled, and it really paved the way. So the rounding up of Japanese Americans was a very popular event. The newspapers, the media was all in favor of it. Political leaders built their careers on the rounding up of Japanese Americans. Earl Warren, at that time, was the Attorney General of California. He ran for governor of California on the slogan, "The Japs must go." Later, one of the greatest Chief Justices of the Supreme Court in the court's history. But when he was the politician, Earl Warren, he was on the bandwagon to imprison Japanese Americans. And so this was, by and large, a very popular thing. The Quakers, American Friends Service Committee, was probably one of the few organizations that opposed the rounding up. Even the National Board of the ACLU had issued orders to its local chapters not to represent Japanese Americans. They reversed that position by the time that Fred Korematsu's case came up in 1944, but their initial reaction was to support the war effort, even to the point of implementing these racist military orders without trial and for no offense. When everything is going well, when the economy is going great, the country's at peace, the Constitution is not tested. The Constitution is tested when our country is under stress. And that's when democratic institutions, each being a check and balance on the other, Congress, the executive, the courts, all play a role in a functioning democracy. The tragedy of the Korematsu case is that Congress basically targeted this segment of the population without any evidence of any wrongdoing, except that they happened to look like the enemy. And when the challenges of Fred Korematsu, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Minoru Yasui came before the Supreme Court, asking what is the basis for rounding up Americans, especially American citizens, the court never asked any questions. It basically said, if the military tells us this mass imprisonment makes the country safer, then we believe the military. And that's a frightening lesson going forward. At that time in 1944, the court was badly divided 6-3. And Justice Robert Jackson wrote in a very prescient dissent, he said, the court for all time has validated the principle of racial discrimination. The principle lies around like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority who could put forth a plausible claim of an urgent need. What did he mean by that? He meant that if there is a public clamor, without evidence, without trial, without any good reason, an entire racial group could be locked up and the Constitution essentially rendered null and void. And that is a dangerous principle. And unfortunately, the country is at risk of repeating that same mistake. Democratic institutions are most important when the country is under stress. What the Korematsu case tells us, what the lesson of the Japanese-American incarceration tells us, is that at that time, these principles must be upheld or democracy is lost. The gravity of the court's passivity and deference to the executive branch wasn't really known until 37 years later, when quite by accident, researchers Peter Irons and Aiko Yoshinaga Herzig found Justice Department memoranda, intelligence reports from the FBI, the Federal Communications Commission, the Office of Naval Intelligence. In fact, every intelligence agency having anything to do with Japanese Americans on the West Coast had weighed in and said, the Navy said that there was no reason to round these people up. It should be dealt with on an individual basis rather than on a mass racial basis. The Federal Communications Commission said, contrary to the Army's claims that Japanese Americans were engaging in espionage, that it wasn't happening. J. Edgar Hoover wrote back saying, we've investigated every single claim of shore-to-ship signaling, and none of it is true since the beginning of the war. We found memoranda between Justice Department lawyers saying, you know, if the Office of the Navy Intelligence, the primary entity having jurisdiction over national security, says that there's no reason for rounding these people up, it occurs to me that if we don't include that evidence before the U.S. Supreme Court, we're engaging in the suppression of evidence. And he wrote that to Charles Fahey, the Solicitor General of the United States, the top legal officer that argues these cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. The Attorney General was given these intelligence reports. But at the end of the day, despite protests of Justice Department lawyers, that evidence was suppressed and in one case burned and in another case fabricated. So the concept of the checks and balances is really critical. When no one is watching, when there is no check and balance on the executive, I think the temptation for political leaders to bend the facts, to fabricate evidence, in order to achieve a political result, not the ends of justice, but a political end, that temptation becomes overwhelming. And I think the founders of this country understood that. The genius of the system is it was designed to thwart the rise of kings and tyrants. There's a check and balance going on. And even in times of national distress, that system should still continue to operate. And in the case of Japanese Americans, it failed utterly. When in fact, there was a declared military necessity, a national emergency. In fact, it didn't exist. It was fake news. And we risk that repeating itself all over again. And you don't have to convince Japanese Americans of the danger of that. They're very well aware that with the attacks on vilification of Muslim persons of Islamic background and beliefs, migrants, immigrants, that this is a replay of what happened to Japanese Americans 77 years ago. When these cases floated up to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1943 and 1944, bear in mind that the rounding up of Americans was a fait accompli. By the end of 1942, it was done. 120,000 people had already lost their freedom and their property and their businesses and been displaced. And so when these cases came up to the U.S. Supreme Court, in Fred's case, it was 1944, in order to defend this challenge before the U.S. Supreme Court, the Justice Department, person by the name of Edward Ennis, head of the Enemy Alien Control Division and responsible for supervising the drafting of the government's brief, began calling up intelligence reports in order to make the case. And I think what he expected to find was corroborating evidence of the Army's claims that Japanese Americans were engaging in espionage and sabotage. But to his astonishment, he found exactly the opposite. And when he examined the Office of Naval Intelligence report recommending against the mass roundup, bells and alarms went off in his head, and he wrote to the Solicitor General, Charles Fahey, and said, "It occurs to me that we have a duty to disclose the contents of the Navy's report. Any other course of conduct would, quote, approximate the suppression of evidence." Charles Fahey ignored the memo, simply ignored it. Ennis, concerned about being in an ethical dilemma of not wanting to lie to the U.S. Supreme Court, then wrote to Federal Communications Commission Chair George Sterling. And he asked George Sterling, what about these reports from the Army that Japanese Americans are engaging in signaling? George Sterling writes back to him and said, we met with the general staff. These are privates that can only read 10 words a minute. They're picking up radio signals emanating from Tokyo, and they're calling them shore-to-ship transmissions. These enlisted men pass it on to the general, and knowing no better, he accepts their word for it. Quote, "It's pathetic, to say the least." Now, after Ennis reads this, he gets more concerned. He writes to J. Edgar Hoover and says, "Do you have any evidence of wrongdoing?" And J. Edgar Hoover said, "We've investigated every single claim, and there's nothing that we found since the beginning of the war that would indicate that crimes are being committed." So at that point, Ennis enlists the help of John Burling, another Justice Department lawyer, and getting no response from the Attorney General of the United States, Francis Biddle, and getting no response from Herbert Wexler, the Assistant Attorney General, they embark on a plan to insert a footnote in the Korematsu brief. And the footnote basically says, we have in our possession intelligence reports from our own agencies which contradict the claims of the Army. and doesn't go into the details of what J. Edgar Hoover wrote or the Federal Communications Commission, but it was meant to alert the court that the information that the Justice Department was putting out, that the Army was stating, was unreliable. And the War Department, under Secretary John J. McCloy, finds out about the footnote. He literally orders the printing presses stopped. You know, the briefs are printed into booklets. The footnote is ordered removed and rewritten. It's rewritten, and it basically says we have in our possession reports which tend to corroborate the Army's claims. And so the last attempt to alert the court that something was not right, that these claims were really resting on a foundation of fraud, simply failed. So in that sense, it's really a scandal of enormous proportions that the government would manipulate the evidence in order to effect an outcome of a case, even if it meant lying to the U.S. Supreme Court. There was other evidence we found where the War Department ordered the burning of the evidence. General DeWitt had initiated a final report explaining to the court the reasons for this rounding up. And one of the statements in it was not that there was insufficient time to determine the loyal from the disloyal. It was as a matter of, because these people are so different from true Americans, that it was impossible, quote unquote, to separate the sheep from the goats. Well, John J. McCloy, the Undersecretary of War, found out about that statement. He concluded that the court would never buy that because it's a purely racist argument. And he was angry, and we found transcripts of their telephone conversations. He ordered the 10 copies of the final report returned, and that segment was rewritten to say the exact opposite, that the reason the mass roundup was necessary is there wasn't enough time to individually determine loyalty, and therefore a mass roundup was necessary. And all 10 copies were ordered returned, but only 9 copies actually made their way back. One was lost, only to be found 37 years later by these researchers who just stumbled upon it. So historically, we thought there was only one final report. There was actually 2. The first one was contradicted the position of the government before the courts that the roundup was necessary because there wasn't enough time to determine the loyal from the disloyal. And those original reports were ordered burned. And we found a memo saying, I, Sergeant so-and-so, whatever his name was, witnessed the burning of the final report. And so this not only was evidence altered, but it was destroyed in order to manipulate the outcome of this case. The travel ban case. When these cases, they were heard, the decision was ruled on in June of 2018. But prior to the Supreme Court ruling in a 5-4 decision to uphold the case, it was being litigated in the lower courts. And in the Maryland Federal District Court, Judge Theodore Chwan asked the Solicitor General, what is the basis for shutting down the borders, separating American families from these Muslim-majority countries? What's the basis for it? And the Solicitor General cited a global Homeland Security report, essentially stating that the country would be safer if we just shut the borders, indiscriminately shut them down for an indefinite period of time. The judge said, may I see the report? And the government answered, no, it's confidential. And the judge in that case said, how do I know? This is not like the Korematsu case, where years from now I'm going to find out that this report actually undermines your position. And so the parallels between the Korematsu case and the travel ban are disturbing and eerie. You know, both arose out of war. Both involve the government invoking national security in order to shield its decisions and actions from judicial scrutiny, with the court being passive and standing down. Both involved intelligence reports that the government has refused to disclose. Both have involved blatantly overt racist or bigoted statements against a targeted minority. And both ended with the courts passively standing down and deferring and abdicating their duty to ask questions. And in both cases, the court basically said, if the government tells us this is good for the country, then we believe the government. The problem with that reasoning is that we know in 1942, 1943, and 1944, when the court did that, and they stood down, they didn't play their role as a check and balance. It was a civil liberties disaster and caused enormous suffering to Americans for no good reason. I was the executive director of a public interest law firm called the Asian Law Caucus here in San Francisco. And Dale Minami, my current law partner, and he was lead counsel in this reopening effort, gives me a call, and he says that he's been contacted by this professor, Peter Irons, claiming to have found secret government documents that might be the basis for reopening the case. And we were quite skeptical. But as we met with Peter and actually saw the evidence, it was mind-blowing, because Japanese Americans and the government generally and the public and even the most educated people who studied this period sort of regard what happened as a, quote, mistake prompted by wartime hysteria. Well, what may have begun as a mistake really culminated at the highest echelons of government as a calculated plan to manipulate the outcome of the case, conspiracy style, in order to achieve a political end. And that's quite different than a mistake. And so we were quite shocked and surprised to see this evidence. Fred's battle was a lonely one. Okay, so Public Law 503 is issued. Japanese Americans, for the most part, dutifully comply. They get rounded up, they get put in these temporary holding pens, and they're makeshift prison camps until the 10 more permanent camps are being constructed. And so Fred decides to evade the law. So he ultimately is arrested. And as I said, the headline is Jap Spy Arrested. And he's basically friendless. The National Board of the ACLU had issued a directive ordering chapters not to represent Japanese Americans. The Northern California chapter of the ACLU defied that order, Ernest Bessick, the executive director. And he went to see Fred here at the Presidio in San Francisco, which was, by the way, the headquarters of Lieutenant John L. DeWitt. So Fred was in the stockade, literally in the same premises as the architect of this rounding up process. He couldn't believe it that anybody would be interested in representing him. And Japanese Americans were in the situation where they were scared. And in any situation, if you put a community people under enough pressure, at some point they're going to turn on each other. And I think that was part of the situation. And there were some who felt that if Fred challenged their rounding up, it would only make them seem more disloyal to the country. And would make life, they'd be punished for it. It would make life worse for them. And then, to his regret, not his fault, but certainly to his regret, he lost that case. 1944, the court ruled against him. And so Japanese Americans probably were thinking, well, we told you. We told you. And little did they know that the government, every intelligence agency had exonerated Japanese Americans, had admitted they had committed no wrong. There was no reason to lock these people up. But Japanese Americans, the community, didn't know that. And so Fred got blamed for a lot of things that he wasn't responsible for. And remember that after the closing of the camps, there was still a lot of prejudice against Japanese Americans. I hated December 7th every day because I knew I was going to get in a fight that day because somebody's going to blame me for Pearl Harbor. And so that was the kind of thing that, in the shadow of these camps that people went through. And so everybody kept a low profile. So did they want to associate with Fred? No. However, in the spirit of American redemption, 37, 38 years later, we found this evidence conclusively, definitively, admissions by government authorities at the highest levels saying, what are we going to do? We're about to lie to the U.S. Supreme Court. Japanese Americans did nothing wrong. We have a duty to tell the court this. And Fred was responsible for outing that information. And then suddenly he is a hero in the Japanese American community. And they knew that here's the guy that was responsible for vindicating them and providing them with their day in court. So it has a happy ending, but it does require the courage of your convictions to basically stay the course when no one is supporting you, and a willingness to go through that. And the country is fortunate and for the better that he did it. I think this is not uncommon for any group that's gone through some trauma, and bear in mind that after the camps closed, at the end of the war and the last inmate was released, people had to go back to the very communities that exiled them in the first place. And this had been tested by the U.S. Supreme Court, had been reviewed. And so I think the public thought, well, there must have been a good reason for locking you up. And therefore, in a backhanded kind of way, Japanese Americans felt ashamed of what had happened to them, when in fact, it was really the opposite. The government is the one that should have been ashamed at what happened. I know when Fred Korematsu was approached by Peter on this, Peter Irons, he had no idea the scale of what had happened to him. Of course, he knew he wasn't a spy. He knew he was a loyal American citizen, but he had no idea the lengths that the government went in order to uphold his criminal conviction in this landmark case. And his response was, after reading the documents, according to Peter, he said, they'd done me a great wrong. Well, that statement, he spoke for an entire racial population. My parents really didn't speak about the camps, but during the course of the preparation, I brought the sheaf of documents home, and I said, you gotta take a look at this. And as they sifted through the FBI reports and the Navy reports and the Federal Communication Commission reports and the Justice Department memoranda, where lawyers are wringing their hands about ethical violations and their duty not to lie to the court, then they began talking about it. I mean, the dam broke at that point, and my parents really talked a lot about it, and I understood at that point it was really the defining event for that generation. My father was about to graduate from the University of California at Berkeley with a pharmacy degree when General DeWitt's orders to report to these temporary prison camps, in this case a racetrack Tanforan was issued. And entire families were put into horse stalls. So you can imagine if you live in a house with a bed and furniture and the comforts of home, and then you're living in a horse stall with, no heat, no hot water, maybe one electrical naked light bulb, where horses are, manure, straw, the whole bit. And that's where they were housed. And the University of California, Berkeley sent him his diploma wrapped in a mailing tube. And I keep that tube because it metaphorically shows me how far we've come as a people. So the tube is addressed to Tanforan Assembly Center. That was a euphemism for this temporary prison camp. Barrack 29, Apartment 5. Well, Apartment 5 is a horse stall. And so to me, it symbolizes, the diploma being the promise of the future and what America stands for all immigrants and for Americans of all stripes. And then the mailing tube is really the reality that they were living with, because their only crime was they happened to look like the enemy. And this constraining mailing tube in which the diploma was wrapped up in is really what their future was at the time. That was their reality. And so the velocity of events from being removed from their homes to putting in these facilities to ultimately ended up in these camps was pretty speedy, very fast. And so people only could take that which we could carry. So if you had children, that's not very much. And that means cars, appliances, businesses, all of that had to be left behind and was either lost or sold for pennies on the dollar. So at the same time, I would say that it's a good American story in that it's the spirit of resilience of this community and not harboring bitterness. And they didn't talk about it. It was a good reason for not talking about it at the time because their job was surviving and moving on. But I think for Fred Korematsu and this entire population, including my family, they always wanted vindication. And, Fred's case was really the day in court that they never had. And so when the case was reopened and a judicial declaration that there was no good reason to do this, and the government knew it at the time. That's the part that's most important. The government knew it at the time. And so that's the lesson going forward. The ironies are incredible. Like you had, at the same time, people locked up in camp, you had 18, 19-year-old, 20-year-old boys volunteering to serve in an all-Japanese American 442nd Regimental Combat Team, fighting in fierce battles in an all-segregated unit in Europe, fighting for freedom while their families are imprisoned at home, fighting for democracy in Europe while their families are imprisoned at home in America. That's quite a statement. And in one of the more remarkable incidents is the 100th Artillery Division attached to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was the first to arrive at a Dachau subcamp. The Germans by then had been fleeing, and they abandoned the camp. The 100th Artillery Division is first to arrive to basically liberate and free Jews who had been imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp by Japanese-American soldiers who had volunteered out of an American-style concentration camp. So the ironies and the lessons are quite unbelievable. So on the one hand, yes, it's a great wrong, but it also indicates faith in this country and an abiding loyalty to the country. And that's a good lesson going forward, because I think we're living in a time when the definition of what it is to be an American is being redefined, and not in a good way. America has always been a nation of immigrants, and aside from Native Americans and African Americans who were brought here as slaves, everybody else is an immigrant. And they all can trace their roots back to very modest, humble beginnings. And each has been targeted along the way, maybe not to the degree, some more than others. But American institutions, their historical reach and their memory should remember that. And regrettably, in 1943 and 44, those lessons were completely lost, and we fear that in the current day, they're being lost again. I think the ironic thing is, if you look at recent refugees in America and people, new immigrants, they're the most loyal, faithful people in this country. They're so grateful to be here. And of course, it's a rough road for them, and they're targeted all the time, you know, in certain cases within their own communities, because again, they're being challenged as whether they're real American or not, and yet they go about their business, and I think that's part of the American spirit of acceptance. The difficult thing now is that's all being challenged at a time when, you know, Mexican immigrants are being labeled as drug dealers and rapists, Haitian immigrants as having AIDS. In a congressional briefing, the president was noted as saying, you know, why would Nigerians go back to their huts in Africa? Why don't we have more people from Norway? You know, well, you know, used to be the inscription on the Statue of Liberty was giving me your poor, tired, you're hungry, yearning to be free. Doesn't mention anything about Norway. I mean, that's the real spirit of the country, and I think most of the newest immigrants are the first to grasp that. They're so proud when they get their citizenship status. So I fear that they're being scapegoated, and as Japanese Americans, we've seen that. I mean, you don't have to convince Japanese Americans that what's happening today is a problem, because our community has witnessed this. So to their credit, they have not harbored that bitterness, and I think that's been part of the reason why they've been able to progress and build the community and really be an integral part of the American fabric. But we ought not to forget that. We should remember, hold no bitterness, be forgiving, but remember going forward so this doesn't happen to anyone else. Extremely humble person, man of very few words. We had three litigants that we work with. You know, Minoru Yasui was a lawyer, believer in civil rights. When the curfew orders was the first of General DeWitt's orders that were issued, saying Japanese Americans could not leave their homes before 8 p.m. at night. They had remained there before 6. These curfew orders were the precursor to the rounding up process. And so Min was bold and brash and voluntarily, you know, he thought he'd recruit a Japanese American to violate the law and then he would represent them. And people said, Min, you're crazy, smell the coffee. And so Min began to voluntarily walk the streets of Portland, basically asking the police to arrest him. And ultimately, he had to walk into a Portland police station to do it because the police weren't really anxious to arrest him, knowing that he was not dangerous. And for that act of defiance, he spent almost 9 months in solitary confinement before being imprisoned in Wyoming, in a Wyoming camp. Gordon Hirabayashi was a student at the University of Washington and a Quaker. And he first dutifully followed the curfew orders, and but then it struck him that he had to leave the library while his college friends are still studying or having a good time, running back to his dorm room. And the more he complied with the law, the more he gave it credence. So he defied the orders. Fred Korematsu was just an ordinary guy. He just wanted to live his life. He felt that what was happening was wrong. And he just made an individual stand, not meaning to make a point, certainly not intending to be the subject of a major Supreme Court landmark case. But American history is full of these folks, ordinary people that make very courageous stands. So, man of very few words took his stand. He went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and Japanese Americans really didn't support him. They thought he was only going to make their situation worse. So he was, the headline when he was arrested was "Jap spy arrested." And so the pressure on the Japanese American communities to separate themselves from Fred was really strong. And then he lost. So in a backhanded kind of way, he thought maybe he was responsible for this. And so he didn't talk about it, and he was the subject of a lot of people that wanted to interview him and write books about him. And he really wasn't interested. And what he really wanted is find a way to reopen his case, and he was given that opportunity, and he took it. He grew into it because I think he realized how important the ruling was going forward. Bear in mind, when you've already served your time and you've already got a conviction on your record, and it's 40 years later, what do you gain by going public and making statements? Nothing, personally. His point was, this is not the way American democracy should work, where an entire racial population could be uprooted, removed for no good reason, and the courts don't ask any questions, and then 37, 38 years later, it's found out to be a complete fraud on the court, evidence being fabricated, burned, in order to secure a conviction. That's not the way our democratic system works. That's the way dictatorship works. And so he thought that was really important to educate the public on. So he did become an activist in that way. It was a misdemeanor conviction because that's the way Public Law 503 read, that whoever shall enter, leave, remain in, or commit any act in any military zone shall be guilty of a misdemeanor and subject to fine or imprisonment or both. The fact of the matter was it didn't matter whether it was a felony or a misdemeanor. Why? Because they all ended up in detention camps, and whether they were convicted or even charged or not. He did have a criminal record, and there are plenty of jobs where the application said, "Have you ever been convicted of a crime?" And I'm sure that when he looked at that, he probably put the application down and left, because in order for him to answer that truthfully, he would have to say that. And it wasn't any crime. It wasn't like some small matter. It just happened to be one of the worst decisions ever rendered by the United States Supreme Court. So it wasn't something that Fred was proud of. And so the opportunity to reopen his case was remarkable to him, and frightening as well. But because he had already integrated himself in the community, but he was brave enough to go forward with it. Fred didn't seek this attention, and it's not like he saw himself as being a constitutional law hero and an icon. He's become that, both at the time of reopening, both at the time that Clinton awarded him the Congressional Medal of Freedom, but more so now after he has passed because of current events. Sadly, The Korematsu case is probably more relevant today than it was in the 1980s. And as I look at him being awarded that medal in the footage, I also am reminded of Judge Marilyn Hall Patel's ruling, in which she said, you know, especially during times of national distress, we have to remember that our institutions must function in a way that they're supposed to under a democratic institution and not be swayed by petty fears and prejudices. And she wrote that in 1983, before 9/11 and before this travel ban issue, before the war on terrorism. But how prescient are those words? And so for Fred to basically be willing to get out there and be that person to symbolize those words, to me, it was courageous on his part. The reason I said that is because, you know, when he got arrested, as I said, the headline was "Jap Spy Arrested," and he was vilified. He was before the court in shackles, and to reopen his case, he suddenly was, you know, the press day on the reopening, every news agency, not only nationally but worldwide, was at that press event. CBS, NBC, CNN, ABC News, foreign journalists. Cameras were camped out in front of his lawn. And he had been vilified and fried and labeled the enemy of the people, literally, at the first time around. So he had great trepidation as to whether it was going to be a redo of that. Fortunately, you know, this time around, I mean, was a lawyer's dream. You never would dream that you would find evidence where government officials at the highest levels, you know, we're not talking about low-level folks. These are Harvard-educated, Yale-educated lawyers defending the government's program, who should have known something about the Constitution, coming from those hallowed educational, you know, institutions. And so, and yet, when it came down to having the courage to tell the truth, they folded. They couldn't take the political pressure. And ironically, in comparison, you have persons like Fred Korematsu, you have people like in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, who have everything to lose, and they're laying it all out there. And why are they doing that? For a belief, you know, in the country. So I think, you know, that is an important lesson. In 1944, when Fred challenged this program, the legal issue was, is the rounding up of Americans constitutional? Can you do this without evidence and without trial and for no offense? In 1983, when we reopened this case, it's very difficult to find the right legal tool to reopen because most are barred by the statute of limitations. You know, there are devices that basically say that if you want to challenge something, you only got a limited amount of time to do it. Well, almost 40 years had passed. The only device we could find, the only method, was this writ, kind of like habeas corpus. It's called coram nobis, and basically it's Latin for a procedure which allows you to challenge an unlawful, unfair conviction, even though you served your time and you've been convicted for many years. It had no statute of limitations. There's no money attached to it. It's purely to clear your reputation, to erase the criminal conviction from your record. And that was the only way to reopen the case. And so therefore, in 1983, it was a different question. The question was not, was the rounding up of Americans constitutional? The question was Fred denied a fair trial? Now, that's a different question, but it's based on the same facts, right? If you can reverse someone's criminal conviction because the facts turn out to be fake and fraudulent, then the precedent allowing the rounding up of so many Americans on the basis of fake and fraudulent evidence could also be discredited. So we found that to be the only way to reopen. So we won at the lower court level. The government appealed and then withdrew their appeal. So that was a very strategic thing on the government's part. You know, the winners in our system cannot appeal. It's only the losers. So they tactically decided not to appeal, not to take it up any higher. In Trump versus Hawaii, the travel ban decision that was decided in June of 2018 by 5-4, Justice Sonia Sotomayor writes a scathing dissent, basically saying, we've seen this movie before in the Korematsu case, and what was wrong, what was done wrong against Japanese Americans is being repeated today. And Justice Roberts writes, basically in a retort in the majority decision, that Korematsu was wrong the day it was decided, and to be clear, has no place under law or under the Constitution, and has been, quote, overruled in the court of history. But then he pivots, and he basically says, but Korematsu has nothing to do with this case. And so he proceeds basically to make the same grievous error as the 1944 Supreme Court decision did, which was, despite the overt anti-Islamic bigoted statements expressed by the president and the administration, and a campaign promise to shut down the borders to all Muslims entering the country, and despite the government's refusal to disclose the intelligence report claimed to be the factual basis and reason for this drastic, sweeping deprivation of civil liberties, the court basically said, well, we're not going to look into that. We're not going to question his motives or his intentions. The only issue is the president authorized to do this under the Immigration and Nationality Act? And that says, in the interest of the country, the president has significant power over the borders. And so Justice Sotomayor said, well, you've just imported and exchanged one grievous wrong for another, and you've imported the worst element, the most dangerous element of the Korematsu case into a new vessel, which is Trump versus Hawaii. And what is that principle? That principle is that when the government invokes national security, a national emergency, the court is not going to bother to question it, despite the obviousness of the presidential bias and the prejudice, and no matter the underlying reality. And the problem there is this is how autocrats get started. In other words, there's no check and balance on the unbridled exercise of power. And that's not just a theoretical conclusion. This happened. This happened in 1942. And so Japanese Americans are now saying, this is a cautionary tale. And so it's very important to tell the story over and over again so it not be repeated. The country was riveted. The country was scared. You remember, all airplanes were grounded. The FBI and Secret Service was sweeping into various Muslim neighborhoods, and immediately they were arrested, certain people, and their families did not know where they were being taken or for what the reason was. People having validly bought airline tickets were prevented from flying because they looked too much like a Middle Eastern people. And the country was in tremendous fear. It was not unlike after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, I'm sure. But the Japanese American community immediately, the leadership immediately sent out communications to mosques and Islamic leaders saying, we stand with you. We know what you're going through. And one of them, for example, I talked to one community leader in Fresno, California, who had said they had planned a big event for their mosque literally the next day, and they were contemplating canceling it. And Japanese American leaders said, no, you should have it because you're just as American as anybody. And so, of course, immediately after 9/11, they were under severe attack. And by that I mean graffiti on their buildings and people being looked at suspiciously. And, you know, since then, candidates have said, you know, we ought to be surveilling Muslim communities of faith in America. And this sort of thing. And so this targeting of certain people, you know, whether they're persons of Islamic faith or recent immigrants or migrants is not a new thing, unfortunately. And I think Japanese Americans who have fresh memories of this are very well aware and, to their credit, are speaking out. I think we live in perilous times now that I've not seen, and I'm a fairly old guy, and so I've not seen this. I was born immediately after the camps closed, in the years following the closing of the camps. So I've not seen this, and if the Congress doesn't have the will to be a check and balance on the president, and if the courts stand down and defer, and if a free press is being called the enemy of the people, and if we no longer have a common understanding of facts, and alternative facts have as much credence and significance as the real ones, then democracy is threatened. And we tend to believe that, oh, you know, we live in a world in which it'll go on and on forever. But I mean, if we look at other societies that have experienced the rise of autocrats, this is how it starts. You know, when alternative facts hold sway over the real ones, that's a problem. You know, Nazi Germany was like that, and if people weren't able to speak out or they didn't speak out, by the time this thing really gets going, it's too late. They got shouted down. And then you see your democratic institutions really begin to fall apart, and strong men take over. Every American ought to be worried about this. And I'm particularly concerned about the free press. I think that's one of the most important things because of people's perception and understanding and reliance upon facts as we know them. And when demonstrably provable facts, empirically provable facts, are now seen as fake news, and people believe that, and there's, you know, one statement is just as worthy of belief as another, that is a democracy cannot function in that environment. So that's a worry. In January of 2017, Trump issued the first of thrice revised executive orders shutting down the borders to Muslim-majority countries, travelers from Muslim-majority countries. And so we, the Quorum Nobis team, Fred Korematsu's legal team, reconvened and worked with the national law firm Aiken Gump to represent the children of Fred Korematsu, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Minoru Yasui. The original litigants had passed away. But Karen Korematsu, J. Hirabayashi, Yasui were willing to step forward and be represented by our team to file an amicus brief to remind the public and remind the court that when the institutions don't play their role, their constitutional role in the scheme of checks and balances, things can go awry and you can have a civil liberties disaster. And so we filed the brief. The brief was cited by Justice Sonia Sotomayor. We were proud of that, out of maybe 100 briefs that were filed. But the ban was still upheld to our enormous disappointment. And Justice Roberts' comment about Korematsu saying, well, it's been overruled in the court of history, but basically making the same ruling as had happened in the 1944 Supreme Court case, bothered us tremendously. And we decided to also launch a public awareness campaign called aptly named, I think, Stop Repeating History, to basically have conversations about this, that irrespective of what the courts do or don't do, what does the public think about what's going on? And so we've been speaking all over the country about this. And this period of history is something we know something about. And therefore, I think we have something to say about this, about the targeting of immigrants, migrants, persons of Islamic faith today. And so we've been speaking a lot. I think our role as citizens is to become civically engaged. And that means I think people have to be more active than ever before. In the 2016 elections, what was it, barely 50%, a little over 50% voted, and the election turned on about 70,000 votes in 3 electorally significant states. And elections are consequential. I believe in elections, and people have the opportunity to participate. But the lesson going forward is we need to pay attention to what's going on. And whether we're Republicans or Democrats, it's important to be civically engaged at all levels. And I'm talking about right down to the local school board in terms of what is going on. That's really the only way democracy is preserved. And it's hard to do. I mean, most people are very busy lives, and they don't see this as being part of their life. And we kind of take our democracy for granted. But if Japanese Americans have anything to say to the public about this, is don't take your liberties for granted. They can be taken away from you. I grew up with my father saying to me, get an education, they can never take that away from you. And as a kid, I kept saying, why would anybody take anything away from me, and who are they? And he didn't say it, but it just reflected his experience, and that is you could lose your freedom like that if people don't pay attention to preserving democratic institutions. It's something that has to be worked on. And other societies come and go, and you have people rising to power and then being thrown out, and different systems coming in. And we're witnessing a shift in the culture that's very disturbing. And, when you have 600 tiki torch-carrying folks screaming, Jews will not replace us in blood and soil, and the country should be alarmed over that, really. And so, again, referring to my own family and community experience, we're trying to sound the alarm. That's something to worry about when immigrants are suddenly being targeted as perpetual foreigners. They don't really belong here. They're not real Americans. That's exactly what we went through. So I think that's a lesson that should be remembered.